My cousin raised his glass and said, "Some people are still learning," and the room laughed like success was a private club with my name crossed out at the door. The chandeliers trembled with applause. I felt the old heat climb my neck, then something colder and cleaner took its place. I stood up and walked out. The Morrison family never forgets a spotlight, only who deserves it. That's how you end up at table 12, close enough to see the crystal catch the light far enough that your name tag is misspelled and no one notices. Ivory cloth, gold-embossed menus, the string quartet sawing a polite waltz that made every compliment sound like a correction. Aunt Margaret called the reception the social event of the season, which always meant a stage dressed like a wedding. From table 12, you learn to read rooms the way other people read fortunes. I could tell which investor loved Bradley's buzzwords by the way he leaned forward when synergy appeared, which bridesmaid would cry on cue, which Worthington uncle cataloged everyone's watches like they were birth certificates. And I could hear the hush-hiss gossip currents that ran beneath the quartet, tidy little stories that braid a family into a rope. Poor Stephanie. Mrs. Patterson breathed the syllables perfumed with pity. Such a struggle. Freelance, bills, borrowed dress. The rumor had been ironed so flat it could be folded into napkin swans. I sipped champagne and let the bubbles bite my tongue. There is a special skill in being underestimated. You get to gather every underestimator like data. Here's what no one at table 12 remembered about me. At 12, I stapled programs for Bradley's first trophy banquet while my piano recital went unmentioned. The photo frame from that night cracked when it fell off my bookshelf, and I never replaced the glass. In high school, I learned that money talks in two accents, noise and silence. Noise brags, silence builds. I chose silence. In college, while Bradley collected internships like cufflinks, I took a part-time job in the campus endowment office and fell in love with the architecture of deals term sheets, like poetry capitalization tables like anatomy. By 24, I'd stopped asking to be invited to the head table and started buying the table. No one at Aunt Margaret's side of the ballroom knew what the blue-white glow on my face at 5:47 a.m. came from not Instagram, but Meridian Capital Management's dashboard flipping from pending to closed on a warehouse acquisition we'd chased for 12 months. They didn't know what the folder labeled Pinnacle on my home office desk contained 5 months of clean room diligence signed NDA's escrow instructions, a choreography of signatures so precise the page numbers felt like a metronome. They didn't know that my modest dress was just a dress, that my credit card was a convenience, not a lifeline, that banks don't offer lines of credit to sob stories, they offer them to balance sheets, and mine spoke fluent calculus. But families prefer stories over spreadsheets. Ours adored the Bradley Myth, Morrison Marketing Solutions Boutique genius, six-figure contracts, the golden child entrepreneur. At holidays, I became the audience for his TED Talk about grit. "It's about vision, Stephanie," he'd say, as if vision were a mirror that reflected only his face. The chorus was always the same, Aunt Margaret clapping with fingertips, uncles nodding through rental car whiskey, someone murmuring, "If only Stephanie could find her lane." I did find it. It just didn't run past their front lawns. The reception room smelled like melted candle wax and lemon polish. The Worthingtons wore approval like lapel pins. When Bradley lifted his glass, the sound spread like a dropped coin. Quiet first, then attention swiveling. "Success isn't just money," he preached, eyes skimming in my direction. "It's building something meaningful." The line landed softly and cut deeply the way a good knife does when it's properly sharpened. Laughter rose on cue. My cheeks warmed the way they used to in homeroom when a teacher called on me by my sister's name. I thought of that cracked frame, the picture inside it, the one where Bradley's ribbon sits like a little blue sun, and I'm just off-center clapping. I'd told myself for years that someday the family would see me as I am, that if I just kept my head down, the work would speak. But work speaks in numbers, and families speak in narratives, and ours had assigned me the role of background violin. Aunt Margaret found me after the toast in a fern's shadow, her emerald dress a thesis on tasteful prosperity. "Don't take it personally," she sang, squeezing my hand like an apology she wouldn't say out loud. "Bradley is just passionate about achievement." Achievement as if it were a hymn, and he the choir director. She lowered her voice. "We worry about your situation, dear." The word situation hung in the air like a moth, small, persistent, oddly hard to kill. I asked what situation, and she refused to hear the question. No shame in struggling, she said. Freelance is so unpredictable. I wondered which version of me she kept in her head, the girl who borrowed a dress, who lived paycheck to paycheck, who needed advice about the kind of stability that shackles some and saves others. She meant well. Meaning well is how people build cages with velvet bars. The quartet slid into something genteel. The chandeliers hummed softly. On my phone, an unread text from David Kim blinked like a Lighthouse Morrison marketing acquisition final approval. Board Monday to sign papers. I felt the quiet click of a lock I'd spent months machining. It wasn't triumph, it was alignment, like a door swinging open because you finally turned the key the right way. From table 12, I watched Bradley perform success and thought you don't know it yet, but the script has already changed. And for the first time in a long time, the heat in my cheeks cooled. Somewhere between the quartet and the candle smoke, I understood that invisibility had been my cover, and I was done wearing it. Bradley's toast should have rolled off my back like the others. I'd survived years of backhanded compliments disguised as wisdom. But something about that glass raised toward the ceiling, the crowd clinking on cue, and the way his gaze skimmed table 12 like a searchlight, it cracked something that had been waiting for air. I didn't explode. That's the thing people don't understand about breaking points. They imagine screaming a storm of shattered glass a declaration that shakes chandeliers. Mine was quieter. It was the sound of a lock turning inside me, the hinge of patience finally giving way. I finished my champagne in one long sip. The bubbles burned like honesty. My phone pulsed again. I tilted the screen just enough to read David's follow-up, all clear. Morrison deal officially closed at 4:00 p.m. Acquired under Pinnacle Digital Holdings. Your call if you want to reveal. The irony almost made me laugh, Bradley bragging about building something meaningful while the ink had already dried on the papers transferring his company into my portfolio. The family saw me as the unpaid intern in the story of their success. They didn't realize I was the publisher who owned the press. Aunt Margaret's voice, syrup thick, draped over me. If you ever need Bradley's advice about starting a business... Advice. From a man whose agency couldn't manage its debt-to-cash ratio, whose client churn had doubled last quarter, whose revenue looked impressive only if you ignored the bleeding margins. I knew his numbers better than he did, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because my investors trusted me to find undervalued assets before they collapsed under their own myths. The breaking point wasn't rage, it was resolve. Resolve to stop letting their stories about me circulate unchallenged like hand-me-downs that never fit. Resolve to stop apologizing for success that didn't look loud enough to count in their world. Resolve to claim my role in the narrative I had authored quietly while they performed theirs loudly. I excused myself from Aunt Margaret with a polite nod. "It's work-related," I said, which in her lexicon translated to hustling for rent money. She patted my hand, pity radiating like perfume, and told me not to let my freelance clients push me too hard. I stepped onto the garden terrace, the cool air pressing against my skin like clarity. The city lights blinked beyond the hotel walls, indifferent and endless. I dialed David. He answered on the first ring. "Stephanie, congratulations," he said. "It's official. Morrison Marketing Solutions belongs to us, to you." Hearing it spoken aloud hit differently. For months, the acquisition had been a constellation of emails, balance sheets, and late-night diligence calls. Now it was fact. The cousin who stood inside telling the world I was still figuring it out was legally and irrevocably my newest employee. "Do we tell him Monday?" David asked. "We tell him Monday," I said, "but I'll be the one in the room." There was a pause. "Are you sure it's family? He'll try to make it personal." "It is personal," I replied. "That's why it has to be me. They've turned my silence into a character. It's time I speak for myself." I hung up and leaned against the stone balustrade. The air smelled faintly of roses planted for photographs no one would take here tonight. Inside the quartet shifted into a brighter piece, the melody faint through the glass. I thought of every small moment that had led here: the high school counselor who suggested I aim lower, the aunt who slipped me grocery coupons and Christmas cards, the uncle who joked that I'd be great at marrying rich if I couldn't find a real career. Each cut had been small. Tonight, Bradley's toast was just the last one. The symbolism of Table 12 wasn't lost on me. Always almost invited, always nearly seen. Tonight, I decided that Table 12 would be the last table where I sat quietly while others narrated my life. Inside, laughter rose again, Bradley charming Amanda's relatives with stories of expansion. He gestured like a man unveiling a monument. I watched from the terrace the glass pane, turning him into a silent film character mouth, moving arms, painting success into the air. My chest should have burned with anger. Instead, it filled with an unexpected calm. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about no longer agreeing with them by staying quiet. I re-entered the reception with a steady breath. The room hadn't changed. The chandeliers still glowed, the silk still shimmered, the quartet still played. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't there to endure the role they wrote for me. I was there to outgrow it. When Mrs. Patterson leaned toward her companion again, whispering about my situation, I didn't flinch. I let her words skim past like gnats against glass. She didn't know that, while she whispered, the ink of ownership already bore my signature. Bradley raised his glass once more for a smaller circle of admirers. Success, I heard him say, isn't for everyone. This time, instead of heat in my cheeks, I felt steel in my spine. The breaking point had arrived, and unlike every other time, I wasn't going to swallow it down and let the story move on without me. I smiled, not for Bradley, not for Aunt Margaret, not for the gossiping chorus at Table 12. I smiled because the next chapter was mine to write, and the pen was already in my hand. The thing about a counterattack is that the best ones don't look like war. They look like silence, like a cousin sipping champagne at the back table while signatures dry in rooms far from the chandeliers. While Bradley basked in his curated spotlight, the machinery I'd built hummed invisibly beneath his feet. Meridian Capital Management was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be inevitable. We'd structured acquisitions through a network of subsidiaries, shells and shells, until the truth became a Russian doll with my name hidden at the very center. Pinnacle Digital Holdings was just one of those shells, faceless enough to be credible, polished enough to lure egos like Bradley's into feeling validated. The diligence team had combed through his company for months, quietly noting the rot behind the glossy pitch decks: client retention falling, margins thinning, a ballooning payroll justified by Bradley's speeches about investing in talent. The numbers told a story very different from the one he sold at family gatherings. And now that story belonged to me. I didn't need to storm the reception or wave contracts under anyone's nose. My counterattack had been planned in conference rooms with no chandeliers, lit by fluorescent buzz, where David and I mapped debt structures on whiteboards until the ink stained our hands. The deal was paper cuts and persistence, not drama. But oh, the drama it would create once the curtain lifted. The beauty of silence is that it unsettles people who expect noise. Aunt Margaret leaned toward me during the cake, cutting her concern still rehearsed. "Darling, don't give up. One day you'll find your passion." I simply smiled, thinking of the wire transfers already executed. My passion was buying companies people underestimated, much like me. And then came the second domino. Uncle Robert's call. I stepped outside again, the night air cooler, now the terrace lamps buzzing faintly. His voice carried urgency and bewilderment. Stephanie Meridian Capital made an offer for Morrison Industries. $15 million. All cash. No contingencies. The words tasted electric in my ears. David hadn't told me he was pulling the trigger tonight, but I understood why. Bradley's wedding gathered every Morrison in one glittering cage, a perfect stage for coincidence to expose itself as orchestration. "That's a strong offer," I told Uncle Robert carefully, while my mind replayed spreadsheets. Meridian had tracked Morrison Industries for months. Solid equipment, stable contracts, but stagnant innovation. We knew modernization could double its valuation in 5 years. What he heard as too good to be true, I recognized as calculated. The strange part, he said, is how quickly they want to close. 30 days. Who does that? I almost smiled. Me, I thought. Someone who had built her career on striking fast, seizing before hesitation invited competitors. But I said only, some firms operate that way. He pressed further. The rep David Kim said the owner has family ties here, knows the culture. Do you know anything about that? My throat tightened. The silence between us grew heavy, threaded with possibility. He was closer than he realized, but this was not the night for revelation, not yet. When I returned inside, Bradley had migrated toward table 12, slumming it for an audience. He bragged loudly about the acquisition he believed was elevating him. Pinnacle Digital Holdings, he declared, voice-rich with self-importance. We're talking expansion real capital the next level. The guests around me leaned in charmed. I listened with the serenity of someone who already knew the ending. My counterattack wasn't to argue or interrupt. It was to let him hang his pride on a hook I had already unscrewed from the wall. Every dismissive remark he lobbed my way, "This isn't like your freelance gigs," wasn't a dagger. It was kindling. Because Monday morning, the kindling would catch fire when he walked into a boardroom and realized the investors he worshipped reported directly to me. That night, I kept my silence like armor. Let them dissect my supposed financial struggles. Let them measure my worth in borrowed dresses and imagined bills. Every whisper was another blindfold they tied across their own eyes, and I had no intention of removing it for them until the moment mattered most. My counterattack was patience disguised as passivity. It was nodding when they pitied me. It was smiling when they lectured me. It was letting them believe the fiction of my struggle so thoroughly that the truth, when revealed, would feel like thunder in their carefully scripted sky. On the terrace once more, I gazed at the city lights beyond the hotel. The skyline shimmered like a balanced sheet columns of glass and steel, each tower a number on the ledger of ambition. I thought of the symbolic table 12 of years spent in corners and realized the irony they had pushed me to the edges, and from the edges you can see the whole board. The silent counterattack was complete. Every piece moved, every paper signed. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but it was set gleaming beneath the surface of their assumptions. And as Bradley toasted to vision inside, I whispered to myself on the night air, "Vision is seeing the checkmate 10 moves before your opponent even realizes the game has started." The power struggle began before anyone realized there was a struggle at all. It started with whispers thin as smoke, but smoke always hints at fire. Back at table 12, Mrs. Patterson was still conducting her pity opera. "The problem with freelancers," she sighed as though addressing an invisible classroom, "is no stability, feast or famine. Mostly famine." Her companion nodded gravely like she'd just uncovered a law of physics. They hadn't noticed I'd returned to my seat, or maybe they thought I was deaf as well as destitute. I didn't interrupt. That's the thing. Silence is its own weapon. I let their words circle like moths around a flame they couldn't see. Bradley appeared at the table next, champagne glow on his cheeks, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned in triumph. "Stephanie!" he boomed, pulling up a chair as though lowering himself among peasants. "You'll appreciate this Pinnacle Digital Holdings is acquiring my company. Monday we sign." His grin split wide. He looked at me as if expecting awe, maybe envy. Instead, I asked lightly, "Have you met the actual owners yet?" Bradley waved a dismissive hand. "Not necessary. Serious business people don't waste time on socializing. Numbers, performance, results, that's what matters. This isn't like your little freelance projects." The table winced, silence crackling where laughter should have been. Even Mrs. Patterson shifted in her chair. But Bradley, drunk on both champagne and validation, didn't notice. He leaned back, confident that he'd made some profound point. The quartet played something lilting in the background, but the music couldn't soften the edges of his words. The gossip network thrummed. I saw heads tilt, lips press together, glances dart in my direction. I didn't rise. Not yet. That's when Uncle Robert arrived, his face pale and serious. "Bradley, I need a word." They stepped a few feet away, but the acoustics of the reception hall carried their voices like a megaphone. "Son, I just received an offer from Morrison Industries. 15 million. All cash. Closing in 30 days. Bradley's glass froze halfway to his lips. "From who?" "Meridian Capital Management." The name dropped into the air like a stone into a pond, ripples spreading instantly. Nearby, guests turned their heads. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. Bradley barked a laugh. "Dad, that's incredible. Can you imagine our family's about to become very wealthy? Both of us acquired in the same week." Uncle Robert frowned. "Don't you find that suspicious? Two different companies, same timing. What if these acquisitions are connected?" "Impossible?" Bradley insisted, but his voice cracked faintly. He tried to cover it with bravado. "These are different industries, different strategies. Just coincidence." Uncle Robert scrolled furiously on his phone, his face blanching as he read. Then he looked up, his voice shaking. "Bradley Pinnacle Digital Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Capital Management." The stem of Bradley's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, sending shards skittering under tables. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The quartet faltered bows, squeaking before silence swallowed the room. All eyes turned toward Bradley, his face gone slack, mouth opening but forming no words. "That can't be right," he whispered. "It's in the filings," Uncle Robert replied. "Same company is buying both businesses." Gasps rustled through the crowd. People craned their necks, hungry for drama. Aunt Margaret clutched her necklace, whispering prayers to no one in particular. Amanda's family looked bewildered, their perfect smiles dissolving. And then Uncle Robert's gaze fell on me, slowly, steadily, like a man fitting a puzzle piece at last. "So, Stephanie," he asked, his voice carrying across the frozen reception hall, "you don't happen to know anything about Meridian Capital, do you?" The room pivoted with him, every stare like a spotlight. Bradley's eyes locked on mine, frantic, desperate. Aunt Margaret's lips parted, a whisper on the edge. I didn't hurry. I set down my glass carefully. The stem clicked against the tablecloth, the sound oddly loud in the hush. I stood smoothing the skirt of my dress, not a borrowed one, just mine. "Actually," I said into the silence, "I do." No one breathed. The chandeliers hummed. Even the quartet waited, bows suspended. "Meridian Capital Management is my firm." The words detonated silently, a pressure wave rolling through the hall. Gasps, a muffled "what" from Mrs. Patterson. Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Bradley stared as if I'd started speaking another language. I held the silence. Let them marinate in the reality that the girl they'd relegated to table 12, the one they pitied, the one they scorned, was the one pulling the strings. The power struggle had arrived. And this time, I wasn't playing defense. The silence after my words felt heavier than the chandeliers. I could see it pressing down on everyone's shoulders, on Bradley's flushed face, on Aunt Margaret's trembling hands, on Mrs. Patterson's wide, embarrassed eyes. "You own what?" Bradley croaked, his voice thinned of all its usual confidence. "Meridian Capital Management," I repeated evenly. "The firm acquiring Morrison Marketing and Morrison Industries. My firm." The crowd murmured, disbelieving. Someone gasped audibly. Another whispered, "But she's broke, isn't she?" I let the murmurs swirl for a moment before continuing. "For years you've all traded stories about my situation. You assumed bills I never missed, debts I never had, careers I never pursued. You never asked me. You just decided. Tonight, those stories end." Bradley staggered back half a step, like the air had been punched out of him. "That's impossible. He stammered. "You can't even pay your own bills." The words sounded pathetic now, even to him. I met his eyes. "Who told you that?" A weak silence. Then Aunt Margaret, her voice brittle, whispered, I may have mentioned." Mrs. Patterson, flustered, chimed in, "Well, dear, we all thought." Exactly, I cut in. You thought, you assumed, you repeated, none of you ever asked. The sting in my voice made several people flinch, but I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. Bradley's hands shook around the fragments of his shattered pride. If you own my company now, what does that mean for me? His voice cracked on the last word. I held his gaze. It means we'll discuss your role during our transition meeting. Monday 9 a.m., my office downtown. We'll review management structure then. Gasps rippled again. The image of Bradley the Golden Boy, the visionary, sitting as an employee in my office on Monday morning burned itself into the crowd's imagination. Amanda, pale beside him, whispered, "Bradley!" Her perfect wedding smile had fractured. He tried to recover, straightening his tuxedo. Well, of course. Of course I'll still be president. They said investors would provide capital and guidance. I interrupted calmly. I'm the investor. I decide who leads. You'll still have a position, Bradley. But leadership is earned. His lips parted, but no words came. Uncle Robert rose slowly, his eyes searching mine. His voice was quiet but carried. Stephanie, what happens to Morrison Industries if I accept your offer? The crowd leaned in again. I plan to modernize operations, expand into new markets, and double the workforce within 5 years, I answered firmly. I don't buy businesses to gut them. I buy them to grow them. He exhaled a long, weary breath that seemed to release decades of weight. You're not tearing down what I built. No, I said softly. I'm making sure it outlives us all. For the first time that evening, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Then, I suppose I should have said this years ago. I'm proud of you, Stephanie. The words landed with more force than Bradley's toast had ever carried. For a heartbeat, I was 12 again, waiting for someone at that cracked photo frame recital to say those very words. They had never come until now. Bradley looked between us, pale and undone. The cousins who had always been cast as sun and shadow were no longer in their assigned roles. He swallowed hard. I think I owe you an apology. You owe me several, I replied. His voice broke. I'm sorry. We all are. We had no idea. I shook my head. No. You had every chance to know. You just never asked. Too busy talking to listen. Too busy assuming to see. The words echoed in the reception hall as sharp and final as a gavel. Aunt Margaret dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Amanda stared at the floor. Mrs. Patterson muttered something about a misunderstanding. But I didn't chase their excuses. I had no interest in patching the narrative they'd built about me. The quartet, unsure what else to do, resumed their music softly. The reception stirred back to life in fragments, but something fundamental had shifted. Later, as the evening waned and guests trickled out, Uncle Robert stopped me near the door. Stephanie, whatever happens with these deals, remember this. You've earned every bit of what you've built. Don't let any one family or not convince you otherwise. I nodded the words, nesting somewhere deep where they should have lived years ago. And as I left the glittering ballroom, I glanced back one last time. Bradley sat slumped, Amanda whispering fiercely to him. Aunt Margaret's face was pale and tight. The chandeliers still glowed, the silk still shimmered, but the power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The echo I carried with me wasn't their shock or their apologies. It was Uncle Robert's words, late but true. I'm proud of you. Sometimes the loudest victories don't come from shouting. They come from being heard at last. The drive home felt different. The highway stretched ahead like a ledger line, each exit a number, each mile a calculation already balanced. The night air through my window was crisp, almost sharp, like it wanted to etch this evening into memory forever. The reception lights still glimmered in my rearview mirror, but the weight of table 12 was gone. For years, that table had defined me close enough to watch the toast, never close enough to make one. Tonight, I hadn't needed to toast. The truth had spoken louder than champagne glasses ever could. I thought about Bradley, his face pale as the glass shattered at his feet. For so long, he had embodied the family's definition of success, loud, polished, always performing. But the truth had revealed itself in silence. When the paper trail surfaced, when the numbers clicked into place, his bravado became just that noise without foundation. And Aunt Margaret, whose whispers had turned into gospel for everyone else. She had spent years worrying aloud about my situation. Tonight, she'd finally realized that the situation wasn't mine. It was theirs, their blindness, their arrogance, their unwillingness to see past their own narrative. Uncle Robert's words echoed louder than the music ever had, "I'm proud of you." They came decades late, but when pride finally arrives, it doesn't erase the past, it rewrites the present. As the city skyline rose before me, I thought about Meridian Capital, about the dozens of employees in conference rooms who knew me not as the girl at table 12, but as the founder who made decisions with precision and care. About the $340 million in managed assets that weren't numbers to me, they were futures investments in growth and possibility. I didn't build this to prove anyone wrong. I built it because building is what I love, because strategy is its own kind of art, because success whispered in balance sheets, and I listened even when my family drowned it out with pity. Tonight, I realized something important: revenge hadn't been my plan. I didn't orchestrate this wedding reveal like a play. The timing wasn't scripted, just perfect. The truth surfaced because it was time, because I was done hiding. And that's the thing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about burning bridges or slamming doors. Sometimes the best revenge is simply standing in your truth so completely that the lies crumble under their own weight. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights brushed across my front porch, the same one my family had probably imagined as shabby, temporary, freelance poor. Inside, the reality waited: a life I had built deliberately, quietly, completely on my own terms. Monday morning, Bradley would walk into my office as an employee, not a visionary. Uncle Robert would sit across from me, ready to discuss a future for his company that honored his legacy. Aunt Margaret would have to look at me without the lens of pity, and the rest of the family would rethink every whisper they had ever exchanged. But tonight, I didn't think about them. I thought about me, the girl who once stapled programs for Bradley's trophy banquet, who sat invisible at the edges of family photos, who let silence define her. That girl had grown into the woman who owned the silence and filled it with truth. I turned off the ignition, the night settling into stillness. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked back at me, not the shadow they'd written into their stories, but the author of my own. And I smiled, because sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying what they built. It's about showing them what you built while they weren't looking. It's about finally being seen. And if you've ever sat at your own version of Table 12, if you've ever been underestimated, pitied, or dismissed, then you know exactly what that smile feels like. So, tell me, have you ever had a moment where the truth you carried finally broke through their assumptions? Drop your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because not all families heal. Some just have to learn the hard way who you really are.